modified over decades. Using a crowbar and working carefully to preserve as much of the structure as possible for historical documentation, Stephen pried away several of the vertical wooden planks. Behind them was a door frame, and beyond that, a wooden door. The door was closed and appeared to be locked or secured from the corridor side. Heavy nails had been driven through the door frame and into the door itself, effectively sealing it shut. A rusted chain was wrapped around the door handle and nailed to the frame. This wasn't a room that had been simply forgotten. This was a room that had been deliberately sealed. Someone had wanted to make absolutely certain this door stayed closed and that whatever was behind it stayed hidden. Stephen photographed everything, documenting the wall construction, the sealed door, and the overall situation. He then carefully removed the nails and cut through the rusted chain. With considerable effort, the door, swollen from decades of humidity and corrosion, was forced open. Stephen shined his flashlight into the darkness beyond. The room was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with brick walls on 3 sides and the wooden partition wall on the 4th. There were no windows. The ceiling was low, just 7 feet high, with exposed wooden beams. The room was filled with wooden shelving units along 2 walls, and those shelves were stacked with rusted tin cans. Old salmon cans from the Cannery's operating days, their labels long since rotted away or faded to illegibility. And in the center of the room, sitting in a wooden chair facing away from the door, was a human skeleton. The skeleton was complete and fully articulated, sitting upright in the chair, with the spine curved forward slightly. The skull tilted downward, as if the person had been looking at something in their lap when they died. The skeletal hands rested in the lap, finger bones loosely intertwined. The skeleton wore clothing, deteriorated fabric that hung loosely on the bones, but was recognizable as a suit. A vest was visible beneath what had been a jacket. Trousers covered the leg bones. On the skeletal feet were the deteriorated remains of leather shoes. On the floor, near the chair's legs, lay a wooden clipboard with yellowed papers attached. Next to the clipboard was what appeared to be a fountain pen, the type used in the early 20th century. The papers on the clipboard showed typed and handwritten text that was partially visible despite the age and deterioration. Stephen immediately backed out of the room and called the Astoria Police Department. By 4 p.m., police officers and detectives were on site. By 5 p.m., the county medical examiner and forensic specialists had arrived. By the following morning, the discovery had made regional news. Human remains found in a sealed room in an abandoned cannery building that had sat vacant for over 50 years. The forensic examination would take weeks, but preliminary observations told a disturbing story. The skeleton showed signs of trauma, a depression in the posterior portion of the skull consistent with blunt force impact. The room had been sealed from the outside, not the inside. The nails and chain were on the corridor side of the door, and the papers on the clipboard appeared to be an inventory list dated November 1928. Further investigation would reveal the identity of the skeleton and unravel a mystery that had remained hidden for 95 years behind a false wall in an abandoned cannery on the Oregon coast. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in November 1928 involves a successful businessman, labor tensions in the Pacific Northwest fishing industry, and a disappearance that was never solved. By the end, you'll understand how a cannery owner vanished and why it took 95 years to find him. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and grim. How did someone end up dead and sealed in a storage room? Who had the access and motive to commit such a crime? And could a 95-year-old murder case possibly be solved when everyone involved was long dead? Matthew James Smith was 52 years old in November 1928, a self-made businessman who'd built one of the most successful salmon canneries on the Oregon coast through decades of hard work and shrewd business management. He stood 5'10" with a solid, stocky build, developed from years of physical labor before he became an owner.
Manager. His hair had turned from brown to gray in his 40s and was graying to white by his 50s. He wore a distinctive handlebar mustache, carefully groomed, that was a source of personal pride. His hands showed the calluses and scars of someone who'd worked with fish and machinery for most of his life. Matthew had been born in 1876 in a small fishing village on the coast of Scotland. The son of a fisherman, he'd grown up on boats, learning the fishing trade from his father and older brothers. The Scottish fishing industry in the late 1800s was harsh and provided meager income for most families. Matthew, ambitious and restless, decided in his early 20s that he wanted more than what Scotland could offer. In 1898, at age 22, Matthew immigrated to the United States. He'd heard about the booming salmon fishing industry in the Pacific Northwest, where rivers ran thick with fish during spawning season, and where canneries were being built to process and ship salmon to markets across America and around the world. Matthew arrived in Astoria, Oregon, with minimal money but considerable knowledge of fishing and fish processing. Matthew's first years in America were difficult. He worked as a laborer in several different canneries, processing fish for long hours and cold, wet conditions for low wages. The work was hard and dangerous. Machinery could catch and mangle hands and arms. The floors were slippery with fish guts and blood. The smell was overwhelming. But Matthew learned every aspect of the business: fish processing, canning techniques, equipment maintenance, inventory management, labor management, and sales. By 1905, Matthew had saved enough money to become a partial owner in a small cannery operation. By 1912, he'd bought out his partners and become sole owner of what he renamed Smith Salmon Cannery. Under his management, the cannery grew steadily. Matthew invested in better equipment, developed relationships with fishing boat captains who supplied him with quality fish, and built a reputation for producing high-quality canned salmon that commanded premium prices. In 1902, Matthew married Ellen O'Brien, the daughter of an Irish immigrant family that ran a boarding house in Astoria. Their marriage was strong and produced 3 children: James, born in 1903, Robert, born in 1906, and Margaret, born in 1909. By 1928, all 3 children were adults. James worked at the cannery as Matthew's assistant and eventual successor. Robert had moved to Portland to work in banking, and Margaret had married and lived in Seattle. By the 1920s, Smith Salmon Cannery was one of the larger operations in Astoria, employing approximately 200 workers during peak season. The cannery occupied a substantial building on pilings over the Columbia River, with processing facilities, storage areas, offices, and docking space for fishing boats to deliver their catches. During salmon season, roughly May through October, the cannery operated around the clock, processing thousands of pounds of fish daily and producing tens of thousands of cans that were shipped by rail to markets across the country. Matthew was known as a fair but firm employer. He paid reasonable wages for the era and maintained relatively safe working conditions compared to some competitors. But he also expected hard work and discipline. He didn't tolerate slacking, theft, or insubordination. Workers who performed well were rewarded with steady employment and opportunities for advancement. Workers who caused problems were fired. Those who knew Matthew described him as serious, focused, and driven. He was at the cannery most days from dawn until evening, supervising operations, reviewing accounts, negotiating with suppliers and buyers. He lived modestly despite his success. His family's home was comfortable but not ostentatious. He reinvested profits into the cannery rather than spending lavishly. He attended church regularly with Ellen, supported local charities, and was respected in Astoria's business community. But 1928 was a challenging year for Matthew and for the Pacific Northwest fishing industry generally. Several factors created tension and difficulty. Fish populations were showing signs of decline after decades of intensive harvesting. Competition among canneries was fierce, driving down prices, and most significantly, labor unrest was increasing throughout the industry. Workers in canneries and on fishing boats beginning to organize and demand better wages and working conditions. Labor unions were growing stronger. Strikes and work stoppages were becoming more common. In several instances, labor disputes had turned violent, with confrontations between workers and company security personnel or local police. In June 1928, workers at Smith Salmon Cannery voted to join a regional cannery workers union and presented Matthew with demands for higher wages and shorter working hours. Matthew refused most of the demands, arguing that the margins in the business didn't support the increased costs. Tensions escalated through the summer. In August, approximately 60 workers staged a brief strike, walking off the job for 3 days before Matthew agreed to minor wage increases. The strike left hard feelings on both sides. Matthew felt betrayed by workers he'd employed for years. Some workers felt Matthew was being unreasonable and greedy, refusing to share the cannery's success with the people who did the actual labor. Trust between management and workers deteriorated. Several of the strike organizers were fired in the weeks following the settlement, which further angered remaining workers. By November 1928, the salmon season had ended, and most of the cannery's seasonal workers had been laid off until the following spring, as was standard practice. Only a skeleton crew of about 20 permanent workers remained, handling maintenance, inventory, and preparation for the next season. The cannery building was mostly quiet, a sharp contrast to the frenetic activity of the summer months. Matthew spent the first few days of November conducting year-end inventory, reviewing the season's financial results, and planning for 1929. The season had been moderately successful financially, despite the labor difficulties. The cannery had processed and sold enough salmon to show a profit, though not as large as in previous years. Matthew was cautiously optimistic about the coming year. On Friday, November 3, 1928, Matthew told Ellen at dinner that he needed to go to the cannery that evening to complete some inventory work in the storage areas. This wasn't unusual. Matthew often worked evenings, especially during inventory periods. He changed from casual clothes into a suit. Matthew always dressed formally, even for inventory work, maintaining the dignity he felt was appropriate for an owner and manager. He left home around 7 p.m., telling Ellen he would return by 10 p.m. That was the last time Ellen Smith saw her husband alive. That was the last time anyone would admit to seeing Matthew Smith. By the next morning, the cannery owner who'd built a successful business over 30 years had vanished without explanation. November 3, 1928, a Friday evening in Astoria, Oregon. The weather that day had been typical for early November on the Oregon coast, cool, overcast, with intermittent rain. Temperature had reached a high of 52 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon, dropping to the mid-40s by evening. Light rain fell throughout the day, the kind of persistent drizzle common to the Pacific Northwest in autumn and winter. Fog was beginning to form over the Columbia River as night approached, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. Matthew Smith spent most of Friday at the cannery, as he had done most days that week. With the salmon season ended and most workers laid off, the building was quiet. The permanent crew was working on maintenance projects, cleaning and repairing equipment in preparation for storage over the winter months. Matthew spent the day in his office reviewing financial records and inventory reports. Ellen Smith later recalled that Matthew had seemed normal but preoccupied during dinner that Friday evening. He'd mentioned that he needed to complete inventory verification in some of the storage areas. The cannery had multiple storage rooms containing canned salmon awaiting shipment, raw materials, and equipment. Accurate inventory was crucial for financial accounting and for planning the next season's operations. Around 6:45 p.m., Matthew changed from the casual clothes he'd worn home into a suit. He put on a vest, jacket, and tie, formal business attire that he wore even when doing tasks like inventory that didn't require such formality. He wore his gold pocket watch on a chain attached to his vest, as he did every day.
He wore his wedding ring. He put his wallet in his inside jacket pocket and
Keys in his trousers pocket. Matthew told Ellen he was going to the cannery to finish checking inventory in one of the basement storage rooms. He said he'd be back by 10 p.m., perhaps earlier. He kissed her goodbye and left the house on foot. The cannery was only about 10 blocks from the Smith family home, an easy walk that Matthew made frequently. The walk from the Smith home to the cannery would have taken Matthew approximately 15 to 20 minutes. The route was familiar along streets he'd walked for years. The light rain continued, and Matthew likely wore a coat over his suit, though Ellen later couldn't recall specifically whether he'd taken a coat that evening. The cannery had a night watchman, Thomas O'Sullivan, who was on duty every night to prevent theft and vandalism. Thomas later told police that he'd arrived for his shift at 8 p.m. as scheduled. He'd walked through the building, checking that everything was secure, as was his routine. He'd seen no indication that anyone was in the building. All the doors were locked, as they should have been. There were no lights on in areas where there shouldn't be lights. Thomas settled into the watchman's office near the main entrance to spend the night, as he did every night. Thomas specifically stated that he had not seen Matthew arrive that evening. Matthew would have arrived sometime between 7 and 7:30 p.m., based on when he left home. If he'd arrived before Thomas began his shift at 8 p.m., there would have been about 30 to 60 minutes when Matthew was in the building before the watchman arrived. If Matthew arrived after 8 p.m., Thomas should have seen or heard him, but Thomas insisted he'd seen no one. Ellen Smith expected Matthew home by 10 p.m. When he hadn't returned by 10:30 p.m., she became mildly concerned, but not yet alarmed. Matthew sometimes got absorbed in work and stayed later than planned. By 11 p.m., she was more worried. By midnight, when Matthew still hadn't returned and hadn't sent word, Ellen was seriously concerned. In 1928, most homes didn't have telephones. The Smith family had a telephone because Matthew needed it for business, but many people didn't. This made it difficult to check on someone's whereabouts quickly. Ellen couldn't simply call the cannery to see if Matthew was there. The cannery had a telephone in the office, but the night watchman wouldn't necessarily hear it ringing from elsewhere in the building. Around 12:30 a.m. on Saturday, November 4th, Ellen sent her oldest son, James, to the cannery to check on his father. James, 25 years old and familiar with the cannery where he worked, walked the 10 blocks through the foggy, rainy night to the waterfront. James arrived at the cannery around 12:45 a.m. and knocked on the door. Thomas O'Sullivan, the watchman, answered. James explained he was looking for his father, who'd come to the cannery to work and hadn't returned home. Ellen and James went to the Astoria Police Department to report him missing. The responding officer took the report, but suggested that Matthew might have gone somewhere unexpected without telling his family. Perhaps he'd traveled to Portland on business. Perhaps he'd gone to check on one of his fishing boat suppliers. He was an adult who could come and go as he pleased, but Ellen insisted this was completely out of character. Matthew never stayed out all night without notification. He never failed to return home when he said he would. Something was wrong. By Sunday, November 5th, with Matthew still missing, the police investigation began in earnest, and it would uncover nothing but questions and mysteries. The investigation into Matthew Smith's disappearance was led by Detective William Harrison of the Astoria Police Department. Harrison was an experienced investigator who'd spent 15 years with the department and had investigated numerous cases involving the waterfront, the fishing industry, and the rough characters who populated that world. Harrison's initial theory was straightforward. Either Matthew had met with an accident, perhaps falling into the river on his way to or from the cannery, or he'd been the victim of foul play, possibly related to the labor tensions at his cannery. The detective began by thoroughly investigating both possibilities. The search for Matthew started with the route between his home and the cannery. Police officers walked the streets Matthew would have taken, looking for any sign of a struggle, any indication of
an accident, anything that might explain his disappearance. They found nothing. The light rain Friday night would have washed away tracks or evidence, but there should have been something if violence had occurred on the street. There was nothing. The Columbia River waterfront was searched carefully. If Matthew had fallen into the river, his body should have washed up somewhere along the shore or been caught on pilings or debris. The river was dredged in the areas near the Cannery. Nothing was found. Bodies that went into the Columbia typically surfaced within a few days or were caught in areas where debris accumulated, but no body appeared. The Cannery building itself was searched extensively. Police, accompanied by James Smith, who knew the building well, checked every room, every storage area, every corner of the facility. They looked for signs of violence, for hidden bodies, for any indication of what might have happened. They found nothing out of place. The Cannery was clean and orderly, exactly as it should have been at the end of the season, with most workers gone. Detective Harrison interviewed everyone connected to Matthew's business and personal life. Ellen Smith provided details about Matthew's routine, his habits, his state of mind in recent days. She insisted Matthew had seemed normal, perhaps slightly stressed about business matters, but not unusually so. He'd given no indication he was planning to leave or that he was afraid of anything specific. James Smith, who worked closely with his father at the Cannery, confirmed that business was reasonably good despite the summer's labor troubles. The financial books showed the Cannery was profitable. There was no indication of hidden debts or financial problems that might have motivated Matthew to disappear voluntarily. Thomas O'Sullivan, the night watchman, was interviewed extensively. His story remained consistent. He'd arrived for his shift at 8 p.m. Friday night, had checked the building and found it empty and secure, had seen no one all evening until James Smith arrived after midnight looking for his father. Thomas had no explanation for how Matthew could have entered the building, done inventory work, and left without being seen, unless Matthew had arrived before 8 p.m., finished his work quickly, and left before Thomas arrived. But that contradicted Matthew's statement to Ellen that he'd be there until about 10 p.m. The approximately 20 permanent workers still employed at the Cannery were all interviewed. Most had been off-duty Friday evening. Those few who had been working earlier in the day had left by 6 p.m. No one reported seeing Matthew at the Cannery Friday evening. No one reported anything unusual. Detective Harrison investigated the labor tensions at the Cannery. The workers who'd been fired after the August strike were tracked down and interviewed. Several had clear alibis for Friday evening. Those who didn't have solid alibis were investigated more thoroughly. No evidence connected any of them to Matthew's disappearance. Union organizers who'd been involved in the summer strike were interviewed. Some had continuing animosity toward Matthew, viewing him as an oppressive employer who'd crushed their organizing effort. But animosity wasn't evidence of murder. And again, no one had solid information about Matthew's whereabouts Friday evening. Rival cannery owners were also investigated. The salmon canning business was intensely competitive. Canneries competed for fish supplies, for customers, for workers. There were business rivalries and personal animosities, but eliminating a competitor through murder seemed extreme even in that rough business environment. No evidence emerged connecting any competitor to Matthew's disappearance. Detective Harrison explored the possibility that Matthew had staged his own disappearance. Perhaps he had debts or problems unknown to his family. Perhaps he had a mistress and had run away with her. Perhaps he wanted to start a new life elsewhere. But investigation of Matthew's finances showed no hidden debts or unusual transactions. There was no evidence of any romantic entanglement. Matthew's bank accounts remained untouched. The theory didn't hold up. As weeks passed with no progress, the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses, there was no body, there was no physical evidence, there was no clear motive.
Specific suspect. Matthew Smith had simply vanished, leaving behind a confused family, an unexplained absence, and questions no one could answer. By early December 1928, 1 month after the disappearance, Detective Harrison had to admit the case was unsolved and unlikely to be solved without new information. The investigation remained officially open but inactive. The police file on Matthew Smith was stored in the department's archives, one of many unsolved cases that haunted investigators who couldn't find answers. Ellen Smith and her children lived with painful uncertainty. Was Matthew dead? Was he alive somewhere, unable to return, or unwilling to return? Not knowing was in many ways worse than knowing the worst. Ellen couldn't remarry because she was still legally married. She couldn't fully grieve because she had no confirmation of death. She existed in limbo. In 1932, 4 years after Matthew's disappearance, Ellen petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead. The court granted the petition based on the length of time he'd been missing and the presumption that he would have contacted his family if he were alive. Matthew James Smith was officially declared deceased as of November 3, 1928. The declaration allowed Ellen and the family to move forward legally and financially, but it didn't provide answers about what had actually happened. Ellen Smith died in 1947 at age 71, 19 years after her husband's disappearance, without ever learning the truth. She was buried in Astoria's Ocean View Cemetery, with space reserved next to her grave for Matthew, though that space remained empty. James Smith took over operation of the cannery, running it until the early 1950s when he sold it to a larger company. The new owners operated it for another 2 decades before closing it permanently in the early 1970s, when the Pacific Northwest salmon industry finally collapsed under environmental and economic pressures. The building sat abandoned for 50 years. Different people and companies owned it at various times, but no one invested in maintaining or redeveloping it. It slowly deteriorated, becoming a waterfront landmark of a bygone era, a reminder of when Astoria had been a major fishing and canning center. And inside that building, in a storage room sealed behind a false wall, Matthew Smith sat in a wooden chair surrounded by rusted cans, waiting 95 years to be discovered. The 95 years between Matthew Smith's disappearance in November 1928 and the discovery of his remains in September 2023 saw Astoria and the Pacific Northwest fishing industry transform almost beyond recognition. The booming salmon canning industry that had defined Astoria's economy in the early 20th century gradually declined and eventually disappeared entirely. The decline had multiple causes. Overfishing throughout the early 1900s depleted salmon populations in Pacific Northwest rivers. The construction of dams on the Columbia River and other waterways blocked salmon migration routes, preventing fish from reaching spawning grounds. Pollution from industrial development degraded water quality. Changing economics made the labor-intensive canning process less profitable. By the 1970s, most of the canneries that had once lined Astoria's waterfront had closed permanently. Smith Salmon Cannery operated under various owners through the 1950s and 60s before shutting down in the early 1970s. After closure, the property sat vacant. The property changed hands several times, with various owners considering redevelopment but never following through. The building slowly deteriorated from neglect, weather exposure, and occasional vandalism. Ellen Smith, Matthew's widow, never learned what happened to her husband. She operated a small boarding house after Matthew's disappearance, providing income for herself and helping to support her children through their early adult years. She maintained her belief that Matthew had met with foul play rather than abandoning his family, but she had no proof and no answers. When she died in 1947, the mystery died with her, unresolved. James Smith, who'd worked closely with his father and had searched for him the night of his disappearance, ran the cannery successfully through the challenging post-Depression and World War II years. But he never stopped wondering what had happened that November night in 1928. Even into his old age in the 1970s and 80s, James would occasionally speculate,
September 17, 2023, Astoria, Oregon. A coastal city perched at the mouth of the Columbia River where it meets the Pacific Ocean, a city with a rich history of fishing, canneries, and maritime commerce that defined the Pacific Northwest economy for over a century. And a city where old buildings still stand along the waterfront, many abandoned for decades, slowly deteriorating in the salt air and coastal weather. One such building was the old Smith Salmon Cannery, a massive wooden and brick structure that had sat vacant since the early 1970s when the Pacific Northwest salmon canning industry finally collapsed under the weight of declining fish populations, changing economics, and modern competition. The building stood on pilings over the water, its weathered wooden siding gray with age, its windows broken or boarded up, its roof sagging in places after 50 years of neglect. In July 2023, a development company purchased the property with ambitious plans to convert the historic cannery into luxury waterfront condominiums. The location was prime, right on the Columbia River, with views of the water and the bridge to Washington State. The building had good bones, despite its deterioration. With extensive renovation, it could become valuable real estate in a city where waterfront property was increasingly sought after. Before renovation could begin, structural engineers needed to inspect every aspect of the building to assess what could be saved and what needed to be replaced. On September 17th, Stephen Clark, a structural engineer with 25 years of experience in historic building restoration, was conducting his inspection of the cannery's storage areas and basement levels. The cannery was a labyrinth of rooms, corridors, storage areas, and processing spaces spread across 3 floors and a partial basement. Stephen was methodically working through each section, taking measurements, assessing structural integrity, documenting the condition of beams, walls, floors, and foundations. The basement level, partially below water level and accessible only by narrow stairs, was particularly challenging to inspect due to decades of water damage, mold, and general deterioration. Around 2:30 p.m., Stephen was examining a storage corridor in the basement when he noticed something odd about one section of wall. The building had been constructed in phases over several decades, with additions and modifications made as the cannery expanded. Different sections showed different construction techniques and materials, but this particular wall seemed inconsistent with everything around it. The corridor walls were mostly original brick and timber from the cannery's construction in the early 1900s, but this one section, approximately 12 feet wide, was constructed of wooden planking that appeared to be from a different era, perhaps the 1920s or 30s, based on the materials and style. The planking was weathered, but noticeably different from the surrounding original structure. Stephen examined the wall more closely. The wooden planks were nailed vertically to a frame, creating what appeared to be a standard partition wall, but something about it seemed wrong. The wall was slightly thicker than necessary for a simple partition. The wood grain and weathering patterns suggested it had been constructed separately from the original building, and most tellingly, when Stephen tapped on the wall at various points, the sound indicated there was empty space behind it. Stephen consulted the building's original architectural plans, which he'd obtained from the Astoria Historical Society. The plans showed this corridor, but indicated the wall should be original brick construction, not wooden planking. This wall wasn't on the original plans. It had been added later, which meant there should be records of the modification. But no modification permits or construction records for this area existed in the city's archives. Stephen took measurements and confirmed what he suspected. There was approximately 10 to 12 feet of unaccounted space behind this wall, a space that should exist according to the building's footprint, but that wasn't accessible from anywhere. A hidden room. Stephen called his supervisor and explained the situation. After discussion, they decided to carefully remove a section of the wooden planking to see what was behind it. This wasn't unusual in historic building renovation. Hidden spaces, blocked-off rooms, and forgotten areas were common in buildings that had been
with family members about his father's fate. Had he drowned, been murdered, run away?
James died in 1988 at age 85, still without answers. The Smith family dispersed across the United States over the decades. Robert, Matthew's second son, remained in Portland, working in banking, raising a family, and eventually retiring there. Margaret, Matthew's daughter, lived in Seattle with her family. Their children and grandchildren spread to various cities, living normal lives with only a distant connection to Astoria and the family's cannery history. By the early 21st century, few people in Astoria remembered the disappearance of Matthew Smith in 1928. It was ancient history, overshadowed by all that had happened in the 90-plus years since. The Great Depression, World War II, the transformation of the American economy, the rise and fall of industries, the old cannery buildings that remained standing were historical curiosities, relics of an economic era that younger generations knew only from books and old photographs. The Smith Salmon Cannery building became a minor piece of Astoria's historical landscape. Occasional articles in local historical publications mentioned it as one of the last surviving cannery structures from the city's fishing industry heyday. Proposals to demolish it and redevelop the waterfront properties surfaced periodically, but never progressed far enough to result in action. The building's interior remained largely undisturbed through these decades. Vandals occasionally broke in through windows or damaged doors, but the interior was mostly empty and offered little of value to steal. The processing equipment had been removed decades earlier. What remained were empty rooms, decaying wooden floors, brick walls slowly crumbling, and the smell of decades of mold, salt air, and neglect. The basement level was particularly deteriorated. Partially below the high water line of the Columbia River, it experienced periodic flooding during high tides and storm surges. Water damage was extensive. Wooden beams showed rot. Brick walls were crumbling. The floor was often wet or standing in puddles. Most people who inspected the building over the years gave the basement only cursory examination. It was clearly the most damaged section and appeared to offer no salvageable value. In the corridor, where Stephen Clark would eventually discover the hidden room in 2023, the false wooden wall stood undisturbed for 9.5 decades. The wall had been constructed carefully enough that it appeared to be an original, or at least long-standing part of the building structure. Without detailed architectural plans for comparison, there was no obvious indication that it concealed anything. It was just a wall in a basement corridor of an abandoned building that few people ever entered. Behind that wall, in the sealed storage room, Matthew Smith's remains sat undisturbed. The room, sealed from outside air and moisture, created a relatively stable environment. While not as preserving as complete sealing would have been, the lack of air circulation and the dry conditions of the upper basement level protected the remains from the rapid decomposition that would have occurred in open air or wet conditions. The room itself became a time capsule. The canned salmon on the shelves gradually deteriorated, the tin cans rusting, the contents long since spoiled. But the cans remained on the shelves where they'd been placed in the 1920s. The clipboard with its inventory list remained on the floor where it had fallen or been dropped. The fountain pen remained beside it, and in the wooden chair in the room's center, Matthew Smith's skeleton remained in the position it had assumed when he died, waiting for someone to open the sealed door and reveal the truth. By 2023, Astoria's economy had shifted from fishing and manufacturing to tourism, arts, and service industries. The city's historic waterfront, once lined with working canneries and fish processing plants, was being redeveloped with restaurants, breweries, shops, and residential spaces. Historic preservation was balanced with economic development as the city attempted to maintain its character while adapting to modern economic realities. In July 2023, Pacific Coast Development LLC, a company specializing in historic building renovation and adaptive reuse, purchased the old Smith Salmon Cannery property for $1.3 million. The company's plan was ambitious: convert the deteriorating industrial building into approximately 40 luxury waterfront condominiums while preserving the building's historic exterior appearance and some interior features. The project required extensive structural assessment before renovation could begin. Pacific Coast Development hired Harrison Engineering, a Portland-based firm with experience in historic building restoration, to conduct detailed structural analysis. Stephen Clark, a senior structural engineer with Harrison Engineering, was assigned to lead the assessment. Stephen began his inspection in August 2023, methodically working through each section of the building over several weeks. The upper floors were in relatively good condition structurally, though they required extensive cosmetic renovation. The main floor showed moderate deterioration but was salvageable. The basement level was the most problematic, with extensive water damage, rot, and structural concerns that would require significant remedial work. On September 17, 2023, Stephen was examining the basement-level storage corridors. These narrow passageways connected various storage rooms where canned goods and materials had been kept during the cannery's operating years. Many of the rooms were empty now, their contents removed decades ago when the cannery closed. Stephen was taking measurements and photographs, documenting the condition of walls, floors, and ceilings. Around 2:30 p.m., he was working in a corridor on the east side of the basement when he noticed the anomalous wall section described earlier. After determining there was hidden space behind the wall and obtaining permission from his supervisor to investigate, Stephen began carefully removing sections of the vertical wooden planking. The wood was old, but not particularly rotted. The basement's upper level was above the flood zone and relatively dry. Stephen used a crowbar to pry the planks away from their supporting frame, working carefully to minimize damage. As each plank came away, more of what lay behind became visible. A door frame, a wooden door, heavy nails driven through both, and a rusted chain wrapped around the door handle. Stephen photographed everything extensively before proceeding. The nails were old, their heads corroded, but still solid. The chain was heavily rusted, but had been strong steel originally. Both indicated the door had been sealed shut deliberately and had remained that way for many decades. Stephen removed the nails one by one using the claw end of his crowbar. Each nail resisted, gripping the old wood tightly, but eventually yielded. The chain was cut using bolt cutters. Finally, with all the physical barriers removed, Stephen grasped the door handle and pulled. The door was swollen and stuck. Stephen pulled harder, bracing himself against the door frame, with a cracking sound of wood separating from wood. The door opened inward into darkness. The smell that emerged was musty, stale, the odor of air that had been sealed away for decades. Stephen shined his flashlight into the room. The beam illuminated a space approximately 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep. Brick walls on 3 sides, wooden shelving units along 2 walls stacked with rusted tin cans, and in the center of the room, approximately 6 feet from the door, a wooden chair with a human skeleton sitting in it. The skeleton was complete and articulated, sitting upright in the chair with remarkable preservation. The spine was curved forward slightly, giving the skeleton a hunched posture. The skull was tilted downward, as if looking at something in the lap. The skeletal arms hung at the sides, with the hands resting in the lap area, finger bones loosely positioned as if the hands had been clasped or folded when the person died. The skeleton wore clothing, deteriorated fabric hung on the bones, a jacket, vest, shirt, trousers, all clearly visible despite their age and decay. The fabric was darkened and fragile, but maintained enough structure to be identifiable. On the feet were the remains of leather shoes, the leather dried and cracked but recognizable. Around the skeleton's neck hung what appeared to be a chain or cord, likely for a pocket watch. In the vest pocket area, the outline of a small object was visible, probably the watch itself, still in the pocket where it had been placed 95 years earlier. On the left hand's 4th finger, a ring was visible, a simple band, likely a wedding ring. On the floor near the chair's legs, as Stephen moved his flashlight beam around the room, lay a wooden clipboard with what appeared to be papers attached. Next to the clipboard was a fountain pen, the type with a gold nib that was common in the early 20th century. The papers on the clipboard showed printed text and handwriting, though from the doorway Stephen couldn't read the details. The wooden shelving units along 2 walls were stacked with tin cans.